Conflicts currently seem to be spiraling into escalation again and again. Consider the renewed brutal outbreak of war in the Middle East, the unabating war in Ukraine, and the rising tensions between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America. In addition, right-wing populist parties and far-right groups, drivers of severe and not infrequently very violent conflict, have gained influence in Europe and elsewhere in recent years, where it seems increasingly difficult to reach social and political compromises, let alone consensus. In today's world, that is, conflicts are omnipresent. The big question is, do they have to take on a destructive dynamic, as seems to be the case at the moment? What could be different, more productive, and possibly even progressive conflictual developments and outcomes? In other words, how can we assume that conflicts will not escalate like they currently tend to? How do we know that others will play by the rules and that institutions will protect us from violations? How can we be sure that society is stable enough to act meaningfully within it? The answer often lies in an inconspicuous but powerful force: trust. Hello and welcome to the first episode of ConTrust, the podcast that deals with two fundamental elements of our social interaction: trust and conflict. My name is Thomas Biebricher. I'm a professor of political science at Goethe University Frankfurt, and I'm going to take you on a journey on which we want to explore the relationship between trust and conflict and their significance for current social phenomena in various environments. Before we take on these questions more concretely, I would like to briefly outline the background of this podcast in this first episode. How does trust form and manifest itself, especially in the context of conflict? What role does trust play in resolving conflicts productively, and is trust always positive? These are some of the major questions we ask ourselves here at ConTrust. ConTrust is a research initiative of the Goethe University Frankfurt, based at the Research Center Normative Orders and the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. We work in an interdisciplinary fashion. That means we collaborate across disciplinary boundaries. We are organized into various working groups, and in my case, we are interested in trust and conflict in economic contexts. And I, as a political scientist, work with sociologists and economists. In this way, we approach our topics from many different perspectives and fields of science. For example, what are trust dynamics in conflicts like from the view of democratic structures and international politics? How are markets and media related to this? And it is precisely this multi-perspectivity that we want to present in this podcast. That's why in each episode I talk with a researcher from ConTrust about their thoughts and approaches to the topics of trust and conflict. And now I can finally introduce you to our guest today. I'm very pleased because for the kickoff of this podcast, we could win no one less than the political philosopher and speaker of ConTrust, Professor Rainer Forst. A warm welcome. So, before we get into the topic, I would like to introduce you briefly to our listeners. Rainer Forst is Professor of Political Theory and Philosophy and Director of the Research Center Normative Orders at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Among other things, he deals with questions of justice, democracy, and tolerance, as well as the further development of critical theory and Kant's philosophy. In 2012, the German Research Foundation awarded him the Leibniz Prize as the most important political philosopher of his generation. And I think I happened to be in the room when the news broke, actually, which was very nice. He's a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities and the British Academy. Forst has held numerous visiting professorships in the USA and was a fellow at the Thomas Mann House in Los Angeles in 2021. Most important publications, all with Surkamp, include Context of Justice, this is the English version obviously, from 1994, Tolerance and Conflict from 2003, The Right to Justification in 2007, Critique of Justification Relations from 2011, Normativity and Power in 2015, The Nominal Republic 2021, and maybe we'll find out over the course of our conversation whether there is anything in the pipeline in terms of another book. So, Rainer, it's a real pleasure to have you here. We've known each other for some times, for some years, and so it's wonderful to have you as the first guest in this ConTrust podcast. To get started and to have a preliminary idea of the central term we will discuss today, we will proceed in a very fittingly Frankfurt way, I would think, in a dialectical fashion. And I would like to ask you to talk about what trust, that central term, is not. And so we can maybe figure out how it differs from related terms such as reliability, control, or hope.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thanks for this kind introduction, and thanks for having this conversation with me. It's always a pleasure not just to have discussions with you, but to work with you in a research context like the one we have here at ConTrust. I'm happy to say something about what trust isn't, but as good dialecticians, let me maybe start with some remarks of how I suggest to define trust as an attitude we have towards others, where we believe we have good reasons to assess the motivation and the competence of others to act in a way that is conducive to our interests, or at least not detrimental to it, without being able, and here the term control comes in that you asked about, without us being able to control, to steer what others are doing. So trust, since you mentioned hope, includes a kind of hope, but hope maybe too much. It's a positive expectation. Simmel called it a hypothesis about the future behavior of others, who again are free others. We can't control them. We can't know exactly whether they will be motivated to act in a way conducive to, or at least not detrimental to our interests. But we have a certain firmness in our judgment that these people, these others, and we can later also talk about institutions, will be sufficiently motivated to act in a way that I expect them to act, even if counter-incentives, possibilities to change your motivation might come their way.
So what I gather from your response is there's certainly a cognitive dimension to all of this. It's always a precarious relationship because there is this level of insecurity about whether we can really trust somebody. And from what it sounded like, and you already alluded to it, in this first attempt to sort of triangulate what we're talking about, it sounded as this was very much about close interpersonal relationships. But the research initiative ConTrust has a more comprehensive understanding in mind. And I would like to ask you why you think the notion of trust should be singled out for an entire research program, because it's obviously not just about interpersonal relationships then, right?
No, exactly. We tend to think of the trust situation as a situation between persons who know each other well, who know they can rely on each other, even though, since you asked about reliance, we rely on others in different ways than we rely on a machine. If I get into my car, I rely on it to function. Relying on others is a different matter, and it presupposes a certain faith, a certain confidence in me being able to foresee the motivations of others. For us, trust is an interesting phenomenon, but we connect it with lots of other terms, and we want to find out something about the social, the political, especially the conflictual dynamics in modern societies. And we want to avoid reproducing a certain notion about trust, namely that trust is a form of relating to others in a society which requires a large degree of social homogeneity, of the absence, especially of cultural difference, and so on. And we think this is, if you think of the reality of pluralistic societies, not the best way to think about trust. So what we want to avoid is to generalize a particular trust situation, say, in families, among friends, and to think about social and political trust in similar terms, as if a political community was some kind of larger family, or should be something like a larger family. Saying that much, and since you mentioned the Frankfurt context in which we place this, we also have to be aware that there are many problematic understandings and maybe even ideological understandings of trust that we need to be skeptical about. So we locate trust in different dynamics of conflict, cultural, economic, social, political, and we want to find out something about the conditions under which trust as a, and you're right to stress the cognitive, trust as a justified form of relating to others can develop in conflictual societies.
Mm-hmm. That would have been my next question about the relation of trust and conflict. But maybe it's fair to say then that the appeal of such a concept of trust is that it can be, that it is sort of scalable upwards onto a social societal level, but it also is obviously an important ingredient to interpersonal relationships, and it takes on this moral dimension, but it doesn't have to. And maybe that's really the appeal, that it can be translated and spelled out into all of these different realms. And you've already addressed the main link of our agenda, and that is the one between trust and conflict. And you already pointed out that we don't view them necessarily as being in a zero-sum relation where there's more conflict, there's less trust. Maybe would it be fair to sum up that we're looking for relationships that point beyond this kind of simple zero-sum relation between the two? Is that a fair way to sum it up, what we're trying to do?
Yes. I think if we don't understand the dynamics of trust formation in conflictual situations, we will not be able to understand how a Rechtsstaat, a legal state, the rule of law, or a modern democracy could ever come about. Right? There has to be a dynamics of trust formation, trust reproduction in conflictual societies. But we are using a critical notion of trust because obviously we live in times, and one of the reasons why the notion of trust has become so important in social science, but also in a number of human sciences, plus economics and psychology, is that we live in time of huge social transformations, and trust seems to be an attitude and a form of social relation that in particular crises, at least in times of social transformation, becomes thematized as something that gets lost, has to be rebuilt, and so on. So we are interested in discourses like that. But as you say, we want to avoid being fixed on a particular conception of trust that, if you think of philosophy, for example, is a strongly moral conception of trust, where you anticipate that others are motivated by benevolence, as friends are, or people you know well who will do you good. I think this is a particular conception of trust, but it is a mistake, as it is sometimes made in various disciplines. And since we're an interdisciplinary enterprise, it is useful to look at the particular conceptions of trust that dominate in certain disciplines, and they are hugely different. So what we do is we use a distinction between concept and conception to say that the concept itself, which is about expecting a certain motivated behavior of others, does not include benevolence, does not exclude self-interest. And that way we open up a possibility to think about various conceptions of trust in certain contexts, social contexts, but we don't want to focus on one particular conception and declare it to be the whole concept.
Now we'll get back to that at greater length, but before we get there, I just want to have one last round on sort of the basic concepts that animate our research agenda, and it's obviously conflict and trust, but there's also, and you alluded to that to some degree, I think already with referencing various transformations taking place, crises taking place, there's that notion of uncertainty. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role that it plays for the ConTrust agenda.
Yeah, I think it is useful to distinguish two notions of uncertainty. One is, which I already alluded to briefly, as you say, there is a certain level of risk and uncertainty built into the very idea of trusting another, because you won't be able to know exactly whether they will act in the way you want them to act, and you can't control or steer them. So there is already a risk there. And the language of trust, which is won, which is lost, in the same in German, schenken, verlieren, and so on. The language of trust already signifies that risk involved in that relationship. What we are interested in is also another notion of uncertainty. Despite the riskiness of trusting others, Luhmann once called it a Vorschuss, an advance payment, but you don't know whether the others will repay if you forgive the economic language for a moment. So still, when you trust others, you have certain frameworks in mind about motivations, behavior, norms, expectations about what others will probably do and think. And in times of uncertainty, where the normative frameworks about what people do, what people are expected to do, are in a certain crisis, so that we are faced with a situation in which these frameworks are shaky. Think of the COVID-19 pandemic, think of climate change, think of other crises where the frameworks of expecting certain behaviors are in question. What is a rational behavior? Will people be rational? And so on. So we're interested in levels of social uncertainty in which trust frameworks cannot be trusted and need to be developed. And we think they need to be developed in a way that takes into account the conflicts that really need to be addressed. So essentially, we're interested in rational trust formations, and that gets us to a distinction we might also want to talk about, because we think, different from what many in different disciplines, various disciplines think, that trust itself is not a value. If trust is not well justified, placing trust in others has no good reasons, then trust is not a value. So we think only justified trust is of value, and rationality plays a role here.
So let's not jump too far ahead. After having talked about these basic concepts that are at the heart of our agenda, let's talk about more about one of these concepts, and that is trust. From the outset, the strategy for ConTrust as an interdisciplinary endeavor of dealing with trust and conflict has been to use that distinction associated with John Rawls between concept and conception. and to identify a concept as a common frame of reference that can really be used across various disciplinary boundaries and that can be spelled out into different conceptions depending on the context that we're interested in. Of course, now I would like to hear from you, and our listeners would like to hear from you about that concept that is, allegedly sort of neutral, has no normative baggage, and can be used across these various contexts.
Right. We do use Rawls as a distinction, as you say, between concept and conceptions. Concept in the singular, conceptions in the plural. So the conceptions are interpretations of the components of the concept. And place them in particular context. So you have a general notion of trust, but you have conceptions of, say, epistemic trust, of political trust, of economic trust. We use the distinction a little different from Rawls, because when he suggested it in the context of his theory of justice, the core concept of justice, and I think rightly so, is a normative core. It's avoiding and overcoming arbitrariness in dealing with others and in organizing society. We think that the concept of trust, as I indicated already, is not heavily normative. All right, a trust that is not well placed is still trust. A justice that does not at least try to avoid arbitrariness is not justice. So there's a distinction here between the two concepts, and I think trust is similar to concepts like solidarity, which can be used for bad and good purposes. But what a bad or good purpose is not determined by the concept of solidarity, of trust. Whereas whether a conception of justice is a good one, you can evaluate on the basis of the very core concept of justice. So we're talking about the nature of a normative concept, and trust is mostly normatively used, that people regard it as a value, but the value of trust doesn't derive from a core that the concept has, but whether a form of trust is of value depends on other normative assessments. So some forms of trust are justifiable, others less so. So we work with a number of distinctions. The concept entails the core, which is the positive a positive expectation that A has about the motivations and competence of B to act in a particular context, C, with regard to something that is at issue, so the trust relation has an aim, in a way that A regards as desired, or at least as not frustrating A's interest. So we define a trust relation in a fourfold way. A trusts B in context C with respect to D. It's important to add the context because it matters whether we talk about trust between friends or the trust I have in a car dealer, where I hope that the car dealer will be sufficiently motivated, and these motivations can be of very different kinds, to not sell me a car which is not worth its price.
So many of our readers are familiar with your work, or at least some of your work, and of course with one of the central concepts in your work, that is the right to justification. In trying to understand what the normative conception of normative desirable trust is, I would expect the right to justification come into play here. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on how you bring these two concepts together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I think as I said, trust is only valuable if it is justifiable. So the term justification comes in rather early. But we need to be careful, because given what I said, we always have to be careful not to take a particular conception of trust to be the very concept of trust. So justified trust requires that my expectation about the behavior and motivations of others are rational, well-placed, that the other will behave in a particular way. And so a trust relationship is reiterative. We learn about the trust we place in particular others, in institutions, and we learn by experience. And once our trust is repaid and gets confirmed, we learn. But look, justified trust can also mean, and that's why we need a distinction between partially justified trust and more impartially justified trust. If I have formed authoritarian views about politics, the trust I place in an authoritarian right-wing populist leader is well placed, right? It's justified given what I think. From within a critical democratic perspective, that kind of trust is not well justified, because it may be dangerous to democracy. It may lead to policies which deprives a lot of people of their basic rights, and so on. So when we use the term justification, we have to be careful to distinguish between forms of justification which are partial and which can be quite negative towards those who are excluded from the trust community, and more impartial and generalizable forms of justifying trust. Again, depending on context, this is important, especially in a political context. In a democratic context, there should be trust relations and institutions fostering trust relations which are justifiable, such that the principle of democracy do not get violated. The right to justification, since you were so kind to ask me about that concept that I have been developing in some of my work, means that persons are to be respected as normative authorities, such that what you think you can do to them, what you can expect of them, and the normative orders they are subject to should be justifiable to them as equals, and not me imposing terms of justification on them. I think for trust, this has interesting implications, because I think that well-placed trust requires whatever else it requires in knowing the other, in properly assessing the context, the situation, requires that the trusting person as well as the trusted person recognize and respect each other as agents with a right as well as a duty of justification. What A expects of B should be, in a justifiable trust relation, should be something that A can openly communicate to B. B can relate to and say, oh, you couldn't trust me with that, or why would you think this is what I ought to do? And also the whole communication situation between the two, what A expects of B, what B then did or thought he or she should do, if that can be laid open, then the trust relation is justifiable. So it thrives on the possibility of exposing the terms of trusting each other in a communicative situation. That need not be explicitly done when I trust you and you trust me. A lot of it remains implicit. But the trust relation as a justifiable trust relation, I think, presupposes that you could ask me about my reasons for trusting or not trusting you, and I could do the same, and you could also require me to say why I did not act in the trustworthy way that you thought I should act.
My next question concerns the link between your agenda, or the ConTrust agenda in general, and the Frankfurt context. We are in Frankfurt, and of course Frankfurt is associated with the tradition of critical theory. Now, one might say, well, compared to the crucial concepts at the heart of traditional critical theory, alienation, objectification, these kinds of things, it's a surprisingly sort of positive term that's at the heart of this agenda. What would you say about that? That's one question. But maybe more importantly, as you well know, in the Frankfurt context, there's a lot of debate about the modality of critique. There's ideas about immanent critiques, about internal critiques. There's lots of discussions about normative foundations and so on and so forth. If I asked you, do you have a critical theory of trust, would you say yes? And what kind of mode of critique is it that you're theorizing it in?
Well, I'm hoping to develop a critical theory of trust, and I think this is an important issue because, as you say, people generally regard the term trust to be as a positive value, and as I said earlier, I don't think it is. There are many forms of trust which we should be very careful about. Quite often, distrust is the better, the more rational, the more justifiable attitude to what people do or plan to do. If you look at it from a critical perspective, trust rhetoric is often used to exclude certain groups from full social recognition, and equality is used to reproduce stereotypes about others. So, for example, since I worked a bit on the notion of toleration, you can see that the question of who you can trust in a society and who not comes up in the history of toleration and intolerance all the time. Could you trust others who didn't believe in the right God, or didn't believe in the right God in the right way, and so on? You would think that in a secular society you would have overcome such trust stereotypes, as I would like to call them, but you haven't. In a recent judgment of the German Constitutional Court, for example, it was decided that legal authorities can ban headscarves that future judges or state attorneys want to wear, because wearing that symbol, so the court didn't say they have to be banned, but they can be banned if the legal authorities believe that the trust required in the neutral state and rule of law could be damaged by persons confronted with judges with Muslim headscarves. And so you see that a social fact, which is the case, people could be, when confronted with a judge with a Muslim headscarf, find this very unusual, or maybe even be provoked and think, that person will not give me a fair hearing. But why would we take that social fact, which we should really be very critical about, and turn it into a normative fact such that such judgments, such stereotypes against a particular religious group should be a ground to ban the religious symbol that that person wants to wear. I think it is a false notion of neutrality to say, oh, of course, everyone is under that ban, so no one can wear a religious symbol. The trust language is a dangerous language here, because it becomes an ideological term. People say, "Oh, yeah, of course we should preserve the trust in the legal state and in our democratic order, if that trust feeling and that trust culture is being negatively affected by certain religious symbols worn by, say, teachers, or in this case, as it was, judges, then we should ban them for the sake of trust, for the sake of neutrality, and so on. And then these terms become ideological. That's what a critical theory of trust needs to say, and therefore we cannot take trust cultures at face value.
And in that sense, it would even be some kind of ideology critique, which is an option that I hadn't mentioned before. But that's definitely part and parcel of it too. I would think so as well.
Exactly. Now, since you asked what kind of ideology critique is that? Is that immanent or internal or transcendent? Well, it has to combine these things. First, from an internal perspective, you can't just mainly take the internal perspective of non-Muslims into account who would have a problem with that practice. You have to take the internal perspective of the citizen who wants to wear this and asks why she can't into account. As an immanent critique, yes, we ought to hold on to certain norms like neutrality, but we can't reproduce the conventional form in which the neutrality principle has been interpreted. And for that, I think we need to go beyond immanent critique, because immanent critique does not tell you which notion of neutrality, no headscarves, rather than a notion of neutrality that is sensitive to religious practices, where you say, as long as a person has been educated to be a judge, and in her practice of understanding and applying the law, there never was any issue, right? Why would having her a visible religious identity disqualify her from being a judge where no one ever had a problem with the way she understood the law? So we need to be very critical of conventional forms of applying principles like neutrality, equal rights, equal respect, and so on. And as I always say in my writings on critical theory, which principles we have to hold on to and in which interpretation we cannot just take out of the context. For that, we need general principles, and therefore immanent criticism can never be enough, because no immanent criticism can tell you which principles are right and which are wrong, or which interpretations are right or wrong. Out of immanence, mostly the conventional ones are the ones that are being suggested. So if you want to go against conventional immanent interpretations, you have to refer to standards which are more general and transcend the given. And also, again, if you are interested in asking which principles that are immanent in a society, patriarchy or gender equality, which are the right ones, immanence can never provide you with an answer. Well, mostly the answer it provides you with is the wrong one.
Now, I want to ask you about, well, since you focus in your work in the ConTrust context, you focus your work on democracy. And so a lot of people would allege that these days we're witnessing a crisis of liberal democracy. Some even talk about democratic regression, for example. And it's quite obviously the case if you just open the newspaper these days that there is talk about a crisis of confidence or a crisis of trust. In the German context, for example, when you look at the government, for example, there's an increased amount of uncertainty over the future of all kinds of things, climate change and so on and so forth. So what I want to ask you about is, first of all, is the assessment or is the diagnosis of democratic regression one that you find helpful when we talk about the crisis of democracy? And then obviously the other bigger question, what specific role do trust relations play in liberal democracies in comparison to any other kind of systemic context?
Right. I think the notion of democratic regression, which I recently wrote a piece about, is useful, but you have to be careful when you apply it. Not every form of regress is a regression. Regression is a more serious term, and I choose not to interpret it in a predominantly psychoanalytic way, which is what the term obviously also refers to. I think democratic regression is the outright rejection in politics of certain standards of equal respect, of democratic justification that we have no reason to reject or doubt if we want to hold on to a democratic normative order. So regression isn't just a lapse in applying certain standards, but is the outright rejection. And I think we have seen in authoritarian political movements in Western democracies as well as outside how such regressions work. They outrightly attack the rights of others, basic forms of respect. So there are many dangers in talking in that way, because one implication is a certain nostalgic inference that when you say we live in times of democratic regression, you seem to imply that the status quo before, the status quo ante, was actually fine. But that is an inference we should reject. You can criticize certain movements today for rejecting democratic standards, but you need not imply that we had a situation in which democracy was fine, in which it was properly functioning. So the talk of defending democracy should be differentiated. We should defend the principles of democracy and be aware that the status quo ante has led to these authoritarian movements and not infer that the status quo ante was fine. So there are lots of problems with drawing wrong inferences from the idea of democratic regression and the defense of democracy. Trust in democracies is an especially important issue because democracy is a form of government where you choose representatives, you choose people who exercise political power on the basis of certain informations about what they are planning to do, and the frustrations of people in democracies when this is these expectations are not fulfilled can generate a political and democratic crisis. Frustrations in non-democratic systems can also reach such a point, as we know from many examples. Think of the Arab Spring, as it was called. But in a democracy, the standards for entrusting others to exercise political power in a justifiable way are very high, and so trust is an important good here. But again, it has to be justifiable trust. And so it's not that authoritarian leaders do not thrive within their own trust dynamics, their own trust cultures, and they thrive on spreading notions of distrust towards others, and especially towards certain principles of a democratic order, which is again why we can't take the language of a loss of trust as a bad thing at face value. Sometimes the loss of trust when in a political system, certain parties, certain movements, certain forms of exercising power do not deserve trust. Distrust is the right thing. And so in a democracy, generally, trust and distrust have to be in a good balance. Democracy is not just a form of politically organizing who rules over whom. Democracy is a form of organizing a society. And for every social inequality, a justification is required that could and does appeal and make sense towards those who are worst off in a society. And if a society develops in a way that such justifications are not even thought of, are not even that they're not institutions in which inequalities are seen as in need of justification, and where there is none, they should be overcome. In such society, distrust is the right attitude and not trust.
Rainer, you've walked us through many different issues here and given us very helpful and plausible answers. I want to ask you a last question, and that is, what's the biggest challenge for the ConTrust agenda that you see sort of on the horizon, or that we have to tackle right now, that we're still grappling with, that we still don't have a good handle on between you and me?
I wish there were only one, and thanks for your kind words. There are lots of challenges. One is to make further headway on ways to think about trust formation, trust reproduction between the disciplines, right? So we try with using the concept conceptions, distinction, context sensitivity. We try to develop a truly interdisciplinary language, but that is still, if you think of how differently disciplines like economics, especially in the rational choice paradigm about trust, than what others say in moral philosophy do. There's still some work here, but that's also exciting work, right? So if you find ways to understand where your differences are, and you don't locate them on huge incompatible paradigms, but on more specific issues, I think you can make headway. Also, our project combines the normative sciences as a critical theory, as a Frankfurt project needs to, the normative perspective and the empirical sciences, and here to find ways to do empirical research on the justifications for trust that people effectively have or would have if they had the possibility to think about, is a major challenge. We have great empirical social science scientists on board from various with various disciplinary specializations, but to find ways to do research not just on what people say whom they trust, but on why they trust others and institutions and why not, and to get access to this layer of the attitude of trust. That is a challenge.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us, and thank you so much for all your insights, and which we will certainly continue and build on in the next episodes for our listeners who have not yet had enough, we would like to warmly refer you to Rainer Forst's publications, which we link to in the show notes. And of course, you are invited to visit our website, where you will find more ConTrust publications, videos, and events, and also linked in the show notes. This was the first episode of ConTrust, the podcast on trust in conflict. We look forward to you joining us again for our next episode. And I would like to thank Rainer Forst once again and say goodbye.
Thank you so much.